Welcome everyone to Your Soil, Your Data. I'm Drew Hemment. I'm a design researcher who's been working in open platforms to support people coming together around environmental and social challenges for 20 years now, and I'm project lead of the GROW Observatory. Thanks to all of you for coming. Some of you will be joining us after having taken part in our recent online course, From Soil to Sky, whereas I'm sure for others, this will be your first encounter with the GROW Observatory. GROW is a citizens observatory, and we're trying to take citizen science to the next level. Citizen science isn't new. If you've taken part in the Great Bee Count, for example, then you've done citizen science. But GROW's trying to do this on a bigger scale. It's bringing thousands of people together from around the world to benefit the practice of individual growers, as well as help answer some major challenges for science. We're still at the beginning of our journey, and you are a part of our first cohort of participants as we develop and test the activities, experiments and the platform this year before we scale up from spring 2018. So on this webinar, a very important thing to say is that we'll be answering your questions after we've heard from our lead educators. And so we invite you to share your questions with us. Some of you already have been, many different ways to do so. The simplest one is to use the chat channel in the interface that you're watching now. We are also looking at Twitter, but that's the simplest way to do it. And we'll be picking up those questions in the discussion. And also we'll be following up on the GROW Forum where the discussion moves after this event. Now in the webinar, our focus is to discuss some key issues to do with soils and growing that can help you in your growing and also that relate to global challenges. And this focus and the themes that we'll present are the ones that you've said are important to you, or those of you who've been on the online course. And our analysis of the 1,200 comments that came out of that during the online course. So we'll be picking up on some of those themes about growing and soils. And we'll also look at some of the data that you contributed from the many people on the online course when you took observations in your growing spaces, and we'll look at some of the insights that we can draw from that. So we've got 20 minutes from our educators to address some of those themes, and then we've got another 20 minutes to hear from you before we have an overview on the next steps for GROW. So I'll remind you of that, but I just want to first introduce the people you'll be hearing from today. So first of all, we have Naomi van der Velden. She's a plant ecologist. Her PhD is in forest community ecology, and her work focuses on plant communities, which she's been more recently applying to food growing and edible plant communities. And Naomi now works as a senior researcher in agroecology at the Permaculture Association. We also have Blair McKenzie. Blair's an agricultural scientist. His PhD was on soil science. He conducts research on soil management for improved plant production, so grains, potatoes, horticulture, as well as environmental protection. And in addition to research, he's taught soils at all levels. He's Australian by birth. He's lived in the UK for more than 14 years and works at the James Hutton Institute in Dundee. Pavlos Georgiadis is an ethnobotanist, a biodiversity researcher, and an organic olive grower. His passion for growing and good food and its communities has seen him travel in several countries across the world, and he's now based in Greece. So a quick recap on what's going to happen today, and remember, keep your questions flowing to us. As you hear from our lead educators, share any questions that you want us to respond to, and we'll pick up on those in the discussion. So we'll be first of all talking about the importance of soil and the online course. We'll be looking at how we understand our soils. We'll talk about soil properties and cultivation. We'll also reflect on citizen science. Then we'll have the discussion with your questions, and then we'll hear about what's next for for GROW. So that's enough for me. Over to Naomi.
Thank you, Drew. And welcome to all of you joining us today, whether you've joined in the recent online course and contributed to the data that we're going to share and discuss here, or if you're simply interested in this topic and getting more involved. So although the Citizens Observatory's projects, including GROW, are focused on Europe, we are pleased to welcome people from around the world who wish to contribute to citizen science and learn more about their own food growing and soils. The map that we can see shows the participants in our recent online course. You can see we've got a really good spread of people from around the world involved in this. In this course, we looked at some of the key issues around soil. We thought about their fundamental importance to human food production, to ecosystem services, and to biodiversity. And we also looked at some of the threats that they're facing, like loss of organic matter and soil compaction. We took a really hands-on approach and looked directly at your own growing spaces and soils. And we're going to share here some of our combined results, focusing on the soil texture observations that we went out and did. We also explored in the course some of our management practices or cultivation methods, and these sparked some really interesting debates about the best approaches for sustainable practice. And we're going to explore some of these further today, particularly looking at the issue around digging and tilling. The online course was also designed to help share the importance of citizen science projects like the GROW Observatory and to help us take the first steps in working together over the next few years so we can develop some real insights into soil and its role in food growing. We'll share a brief insight into some of the methods we used, again looking at soil texture, where we took two different approaches to get the same measurement, and we'll talk about the importance of that. Let's start with Blair. So Blair's a soil scientist. Blair, what inspired you to become a soil scientist, and why is it important that we better understand our soils?
Thanks, Naomi. I think soils are amazing. That's the way I started our online course, and I think it's still true. And I've seen soils working very well to produce food in different varieties in different places, but I've also seen the problems of erosion. And so we need to really understand and think about and look at our soils and get to know them. And that's one of the first things I wanted to get across today, is the importance of getting out and looking at the soil. Of course, they're amazing, and we expect so much of our soils. An engineer constructing a road will want a very different thing from their soils than people trying to grow organic olives, as Pavlos does. So we need to think about them. And in this context, obviously, we're thinking about growing food. So we need to get out and look at the soils. And there's a picture of me, I think, on the screen, digging a hole and looking, just actually getting to know and look at the soil. And it's important to do that, because to get a healthy plant, we want the roots of the plant, whatever crop it is, to be able to proliferate through the soil. And that proliferation means to be able to access the water and nutrients the plant needs, but also to get sufficient root length so that pests and diseases can't have too much of a dramatic effect and doesn't wipe out the whole system. So there are limits to root proliferation. They can be physical, for example, too much water or too little water, or compaction, too dense a soil. There can be chemical limitations such as pH, too much acidity or too much alkalinity. And as I've just alluded, there can be biological problems. Pests and diseases can limit root proliferation. And the best way to start to think about these is to get out and actually dig into your soil and have a look at it. And then you can start to put some proper characterization on it. And Naomi, I think you've already mentioned the word texture, so now's probably a good time to pick that up a bit more.
Great, thank you, Blair. So texture is one way of really starting to understand some of those properties that Blair was just describing of our soils. And it's been one of the fun kind of hands-on part of the online course where we got out and explored our soil. It's a really easy place to start with understanding more about your own soils. Soil texture is looking at the mineral components of the soil. So we dig below the topsoil, below the organic matter, and we look really just at the mineral components. And we're looking here at 3 different particle sizes. So we've got large particles like sand, right through silt to a very fine clay. And what you can see in the slide here is showing one of the ways that we measured soil texture during the online course is to simply place a sample of that soil into a jar with some water, mix it up, and then the heavier particles, the sand, will settle up first, followed by the silt, and then perhaps quite a bit later on, those very fine clay particles will settle on top. We can then measure the relative proportions of each of those and build up quite a clear picture of what our soil texture is. What you can see in the graph here is a classic soil texture triangle that combines the relative proportions. So we've got silt down the right-hand side, sand going from right to left along the bottom, and clay going up the left-hand side of the triangle. And then you can see those dots are what our participants actually found, what their soils are. So we can see that we've got a couple of people with really clayey soils up in the top of the triangle. We've got a lot of people with sandy soils, loamy sand and sandy loam down in that bottom left corner of the triangle. And we've got a few people in the middle who have loamy soils. Now, generally loamy soils are those that have a good balance, approximately a third each of those three key components. And those give us the best soils for growing plants in. So we understand that soil texture is important, but what do these results really mean? Blair, perhaps you could explain a little more.
Thanks, Naomi. And just before I forget, I can see already that there are some questions coming in. So if people have questions, do use the alternatives to make sure that we see your questions and you can participate and contribute. So soils are a function of a range of things. They depend on the parent material, either the natural rock that they're formed on, or material that's been brought in, such as sediment coming in a riverbed. But they also depend on things like aspect and drainage, which are some of the things that we talked about in the online course, and what the aspect of your soil is. And of course, time becomes very important. More time, the soils have more time to weather and form. And so the particles that are there are a function of all these different aspects: climate, time, aspect, parent material. And so this contributes to the nature of the soil. So sandier soils with bigger particles tend to have better drainage because the spaces between the particles tend to be greater. Clay soils are finer, smaller particles, and they can therefore pack together more closely, and that leaves very fine pore spaces where water is held very tightly but doesn't flow through very easily. Of course, that depends on the texture of the soil. The particles that make up the sand, silt and clay, they can form together and be arranged in different ways. And the arrangement of the particles and the pore spaces between them is soil structure. So it's the structure, it's how these things fit together that is very much important. It goes together with texture, and the two complement each other. It's very easy, or relatively easy, to change structure. It's much harder to change texture. So one of the problems we have is that soils can become hard and compact and limit the roots proliferating through them. Now that hardness, that density, that thing that stops roots easily exploring soil can be referred to as soil compaction, and that can happen either because, for example, large machinery, as in this example here of a potato harvester, puts enormous weight on the soil, but also there can be things like natural events such as rainfall or flooding. And here is a case from 2014 on the Sava River in Croatia. But even heavy rainfall can cause the soil to slump and compact. So we need to think about how we can manage that compaction and modify the soil and modify the soil structure, the arrangement of the particles and pore spaces between them. As we move on, we start to think about how we can change manage cultivate the soil and manage the soil. And one of the ways that we do manage the soil is to cultivate. And there are a large number of reasons to cultivate soil. If we're growing a crop, we want the crop to all germinate at the same time probably, and to be harvested ready at about the same time so that we can standardize our management. So one of the primary objectives of cultivating the soil is to get the soil into an homogeneous state where the plants that make up our crop all form together. We also cultivate for weed control. So in my allotment, I know I'm continually having to dig out weeds, to turn the soil over, to bury the weed seeds, to try and stop them germinating and competing with the food I want to grow. Other reasons to till or dig or cultivate a soil include things like incorporating organic matter. If we're applying manures or composts or other things, then we want to include those in the soil as rapidly as possible, and incorporating and digging those things into the soil are help. So there are ways that we can think about managing the soil structure and leading on to better environment in our soil for growing plants. So perhaps, Naomi, you can take some more comments about thinking about what happened in the online course about managing soils.
Yeah, thank you, Blair. That was really interesting to understand a little bit more about the soils and reasons for cultivating. Interestingly, as you can see here from the online course, lots of people are weeding. I think that's something that we all end up having to do one way or another to remove those plants that we don't want competing with our own crops. In terms of digging, then we see a high proportion of participants, over 60%, are using a reduced dig or a reduced tilling approach. Just under half are employing no digging or tilling methods. And only a third or so of participants are actually digging or tilling their plot. So there are also reasons not to till or cultivate the soil. Interestingly, these also involve weed control. So once your weed seeds are buried, if you redig the soil, then you bring those seeds back to the top again. So you can have sort of weed seeds in the soil bank for a long time. Not digging also helps maintain the existing structure of the soil, including the porosity, so those little channels that earthworms might make through the soil or from plant roots that have died. And that can help to improve the ability for plant roots to penetrate, as well as for gases, air, and also water to move through the soil. Maintaining this structure can also help to reduce erosion from the soil and maintain biological activity within the soil itself. So we can see that there are lots of reasons to dig or not to dig. Blair, what's the answer to this? Are there certain situations in which we should do one or the other?
A lot of it depends, thanks Naomi, a lot of what we do depends on both the crop we're growing, our soil type, the texture, the structure, our climate, and some of it comes down to personal preference. Some of the biggest farms in the world use in growing soybeans and maize in South America and in the Canadian prairies use no-till approaches, where the seed is just dropped into a very narrow slot into the soil. But for weed control under those circumstances, the farmers tend to use herbicides. So there is a trade-off between less cultivation and more herbicide use. But the advantage, of course, of the no-till system is, as you've said, we have less erosion risk. So it depends on what we're growing also. Obviously, if you've got a vineyard or an orchard where the crops are perennial, then cultivation is less necessary. And we want the soil to remain undisturbed so that the roots of the tree or the vine can proliferate through the soil. So it's a question of trade-off and making a decision. It's a case of thinking about what you need and understanding your soils, your crop, and then making a decision about what you want to do and why you want to do it. And it's really a case of taking the time to understand both your crop and your soil. So as I'm speaking, I can see there are questions coming in. Please keep those coming in, but I'll hand back to Naomi to think a bit more about some of these issues.
That's great. Thank you, Blair. So I think one of the important things for me that you said there is it's important to explore a little bit, to understand your soil, to think about your own motivations and what works well in the way that you want to grow, and finding that balance between different approaches, whether you need to apply herbicides, whether you need to till, whether you need to find another method to deal with weeds and other problems like that. And through GROW, we want to answer some key questions about sustainable practices in growing. We want to understand if practices like no-dig are valid everywhere. If they only work in certain places, will they work just as well for Blair and his soils in Scotland as for Pavlos and his soils in Greece? And just to really better understand how these things work in real life for everyday normal growing practices, rather than in a kind of very controlled conditions of a more scientific experiment. Whether we're doing science or citizen science, the method is really critical to getting good results. We can criticize science only in terms of its methods. So if you've got bad results, that's not possible. You can only have a bad method. So choosing a robust and reliable method that's easy for people to do when we're talking about citizen science is really important. In the online in the online course we chose 2 different methods to look at soil texture of the many available. So we talked about the sediment jar test, where we shook the soil in water and let it settle out. We also used a touch test, where you can take some soil, dampen it, make it into a ball, and then go through processes through rolling it out and making it into a circle to see what kind of texture that soil has. And that gives us a quite rough and ready approach to soil texture. What you should be able to see now is that we've got we've looked at what people found using these results, and we can see hopefully from this graph that we have in orange results from the touch test, where we see a lot more people finding sandy and loamy sand soils than they did using the green sediment test. In the right-hand side of this graph, you can see that the sediment test better distinguish silty soils and silty clay and silty loam. That's because the touch test that we use doesn't allow us, it allows us to differentiate between clay and sand, but not silt. So the sediment test gives us slightly more accurate, more quantitative results. But interestingly, when we asked you how you found doing the tests, you generally said that you found the sediment tests a little bit easier to do. So what we have is a balance between using a more reliable test compared to something that's perhaps a little more subjective but easier, or we could look at this as having 2 methods to validate the results from one to the other. Finding out what works really well is key to successfully answering the scientific questions in this project.
Thank you, Naomi. Thanks, Naomi and Blair. That was wonderful. We got some responses there to some of the issues that people told us were important in the online course, and we've now got time to answer your questions that you've shared in this live chat. Some of them you've shared before we started on Twitter, and we've also had some in the threads. So thank you all very much for that. So we've got a number of questions. Some of them are very much around your growing challenges, and then some others are more about the project and what we're trying to achieve. I'm just going to start with one on picking up, Naomi, on your points on citizen science. So what are some of the key insights that individual growers could take away from the citizen science experiments?
I think in terms of the wider GROW Observatory, what we're hoping to do is to help people compare and contrast conditions and approaches in their own growing space, so that they can see, what does this really mean for me? What happens if I dig or I don't dig, if I compost or if I take, experiment with these different methods? And we're hoping to, unlike most citizen science projects where people just provide data and the scientists deal with it, what we really want to do is help citizens to become researchers, so that you can see and explore and understand and apply that understanding to change your own practices to ways that better suit you and the land that you're growing in. In addition, of course, we do want to amalgamate those data, look at the big picture of having hopefully thousands of people growing and contributing in their data, and get that some of those key answers that we're missing in terms of which of these practices work and how well.
Okay, let's move on to some of the other questions. So Amanda on Facebook asks, and this is maybe one that Naomi and Blair, if we can get Blair back, can both answer, and that is, which is the best sort of soil for growing vegetables? And is an interesting part, how can I change the type of soil I have?
I can perhaps start off with an answer to some of that. To some extent, changing the texture of your soil is very difficult. You have the texture you've got is what's there, and you can't change the relative amounts of sand, silt and clay without bringing in extra material. And that means, so you can go to gardening centres and this sort of thing and buy in loams or other materials to change your texture. It's usually quite expensive, but it can be done. It's a case more of managing the soil you have and matching the crops you want to grow to the soils you have, to understand the soil conditions, and then to think about what crops will grow best in that climate and in those soils.
I think just to add into that, I think it's very good to look at what works well in your growing space. But there are also some opportunities to change not your soil texture, which is obviously the mineral components, unless you want to ship in a whole bunch of sand or clay, which would be very expensive, but to change your soil texture. So often we can improve our soils in terms of plant growth by adding organic matter to the soil. So that might be manures or composts that we can add into the soil, and that will help the water retention properties of the soil. It will help add nutrients directly into where the plant roots need them as well. So I think that there are some options in terms of improving soil towards better growing. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a theme on this on the thread. Devin on the webinar. She needs some acidic soil to grow blueberries, and thinks she needs to amend her soil. Is interested how. And Peter's asking for some tips for his very alkaline soil.
Well, again, I'm happy to start on that one, because I've 2 years ago put in blueberries in my allotment, and interestingly, blueberries are now the second soft fruit to be grown in Scotland. They've replaced raspberry in terms of importance. So there has been a lot of interest in blueberries, and in my small scale allotment, one of the things I can do is buy ericaceous compost. That's just acidic compost that you can buy in your garden centre, and digging that through and cultivating that through the soil so that it affects the soil. On a larger scale, if you want to change the pH, then if you want to decrease the pH, that is make the soil more acidic, then one thing that can be done is to apply elemental sulfur. You need to be very careful how you do it, because and wear appropriate safety equipment and clothing, but it is allowed under virtually all growing systems to apply elemental sulfur, and all that happens is that as that gets wet, it acidifies into and I don't want to sound dramatic, but sulfuric acid, which tends to be very diluted very quickly, but it does acidify the soil. So you can decrease the pH, that is make the soil more acidic, by adding things like sulfur, or you can increase the pH, if that's your problem, by adding things like lime, calcium carbonate, and that will tend to raise the pH. So pH can be modified, and that has all sorts of knock-on effects to changing nutrient availability.
That's great. Thank you, Blair. I think that's a really interesting approach. I'm going to answer in relation particularly to the blueberries question, because I love them and I've tried to grow them. And I tried growing them in large pots of soil that's largely ericaceous with a low pH. The trouble with that is that they risk drying out, and they like to not dry out too much. So what I'm experimenting with now is growing them in what's called hugelkultur beds. And this is essentially a technique of using woody debris, so from large branches through to smaller twigs, finer pieces, or even wood chip, layered up and mixed in with soil. And this emulates the natural conditions that you might find on an edge of a forest, where there's lots of fallen branches and debris. And those are the kinds of positions that some of these plants, like blueberries, vaccinium, and some of the woody things, I've got currants and gooseberries in mine as well, like to grow. I've also been making my own slightly acidic soil by using conifer needles and branches that I've chopped up, to start and composting those down, because they give a higher acidity soil with a lower pH soil as well. So if you're prepared to keep on putting in plant amendments like that, well, if you have, I had a big conifer hedge that I took out, so I had lots available, but there are also gardeners that often have a surplus, or contractors that have a surplus of these debris. So that you might be able to find people that are just looking to get rid of this stuff that you could then chop up and use as well to change your pH.
Thank you. And someone's just commented on the thread that it's better to fit the crop to the soil than the soil to the crop. That's sound advice. So let's go back to Peter's question. He asked for any tips for his very alkaline soil.
I think, as I suggested, if you're careful, and you can apply elemental sulfur, which will acidify the soil, I've seen it done in several places. It's on small scale vineyards. I've seen it in Croatia, It works remarkably well, but it does take some time. And the speed of the effect and the extent of the effect will depend on the texture. Obviously, clay soils will take more time and be harder to change because there's more surface area, there's more cation, more exchange capacity there. So it's easier to change pH on a sandier soil than it is on a soil with greater proportion of clay.
Thanks, Blair. And just we had one question in a slightly different stream. Before I move on to some other areas that are coming up, just want to ask, Gareth from Twitter asks, his soil was poisoned by a previous owner of the land who used sodium chloride very heavily. He's looking for solutions. Do you have any comments on that?
And removing something like sodium chloride is best simply by washing the sodium chloride, the salt, out of the soil. And then replacing, because you wash out not only the sodium and the chloride, but a number of the other cations and anions at the same time. So the first thing you need to do is to make sure you have good drainage, that you have somewhere where as things are washed through the soil, they can be removed and put somewhere safe and concentrated and then disposed of appropriately. It's interesting, there are cases in the world where sodium chloride is used as a fertilizer almost, and I've seen it in coconuts, growing coconuts and dates in Papua New Guinea. So it can be used legitimately for some crops, although I suspect where our questioner is from, that isn't the case, and I'm not sure why sodium chloride would have been used. But the first thing to do is to make sure the drainage is right, then to wash the soil out by applying or irrigating with more water, depending on the natural rainfall, and then monitoring how much electrical conductivity there is in the soil, and then readjusting the cation balance, probably by applying calcium rather than sodium to the system, because calcium will tend to bring the particles together and form nice aggregates, whereas if sodium dominates and the concentrations get low, then the soil will disperse and not be well aggregated.
Thank you, Blair. We've got another few questions on soil, but I'm just going to jump off to a slightly different topic here from Amanda on the GROW forum. Like those of us up in Dundee, Amanda lives in Scotland, and the growing season is so short that often by the time she gets her plants in, it seems the time for getting any warmth and sunshine is almost over. Any tips?
Yeah, I'll take this one and then pass over to Blair, because I'm sure he's lots of experience too. So I've just moved a little further south in England, just outside Manchester, but I've been living in the Lake District for the last 9 years, and I really notice the difference from Yorkshire to the Lake District, which is like 100 miles or so. There are a couple of things that you can do, and that's think about starting off your plants early and inside so that your seedlings are ready to go early. If you've got access to greenhouse or one of those plastic greenhouses that are relatively affordable, then that can also help kind of extend your growing season. There are also things you can do to pre-warm your soil at the beginning of the season. So if you can either cover with a plastic mulch or with a dark coloured mulch, and that dark coloured mulch will help absorb heat from the incoming solar radiation, and that will help to warm up your soils. And another tip that I quite like but haven't tried is that you can, if you've got a growing space like a polytunnel or a greenhouse, then you can use your composting process generates heat. So if you layer some straw, a whole bunch of compost, food waste materials that you're wanting to compost, so the raw ingredients, and then a little bit of straw around it just to kind of keep the rats and things out, then that will generate heat, and you can use that as essentially a natural heat pad to put your seed trays on top of, that will help give heat to those roots and help those to germinate a little earlier. You then do have to be really careful about planting out and when you plant. So if you follow advice on seed packets that says plant in March, I would tend to look at that as at least a month later for every couple of 100 miles you go north, or a couple of weeks later. So you get to know your own growing conditions and when you can plant out. So Blair, I'm sure you've got some insights as well.
It is a real problem trying to grow things in Scotland, and I think you've touched on most of them. If you can get them under plastic or under glass, that has huge help. Similarly, your aspect, if you want to grow something, picking something with a good aspect that is likely to get the sun, growing them against walls, lots of even going back several hundred years. If you look at the old gardens of some of the Scottish castles, they grew their fruit trees against walls, where the walls would both protect them from chill winds and also keep the ground warm. Certainly, I am for the first time trying to grow sweet potatoes in Scotland. I don't know anyone else who has, and I'd be interested to hear. But I'm trying a couple of ways. One is to keep them in a little glass house I have, and the other is, as you've suggested, to put out black plastic to try and absorb the heat and try and keep that soil a bit warmer.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of questions on dig, no dig, which we can jump onto next. So one question on the webinar. So I do dig, except my raised beds. I get lots of weeds, ground elder, creeping, buttercup, mare's tail, etc. Is this partly because I'm digging the soil?
If you do dig it up, you do need to make sure you get every little piece out, because it will sprout from little cuttings that are left. So if you are digging out mare's tail, it is essential to really take the time and do it very, very thoroughly. The other ones I'm not so familiar with. The point is, there are ways to try and control some of these things, and it depends what crops you're growing. So does the crop you're wanting to grow need the soil to be dug? And obviously, if it's something like carrots, you probably do need to dig. And then it's a case of thinking about weed control. It may be that you think about a herbicide. It may be that you cover the soil and do something else so that when the seeds germinate, that they die off because of lack of light. Naomi?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting challenge, and you've clearly got some with ground elder, creeping buttercup, and the equisetum, the mare's tail. Then you've definitely got some challenging weeds there. I've found with ground elder that actually quite regularly cutting it back, so just cutting it at the surface with a scythe or even a strimmer if you've got a lot of it, can help. If it's small and it's rerooting, then keep on pulling it out. It's also edible, so you can cook it like spinach when it's in the young stages, so you can kind of get your own back on the weeds. So when the leaves are quite young, you can cook those like spinach. But I have found that, yeah, that continuous cutting does help prevent it. Creeping buttercup, the only thing I like about this is that it's relatively easy to get out compared to something like dandelions or mare's tail or couch grass or bindweed, where the tiniest little bit of root, I've seen like little bits of root that like a centimetre long regrow into full plants. But buttercup tends to come up relatively easy, and the roots tend to be quite shallow. So that is one that I would be tempted to kind of dig out as well. I think I've certainly seen people that have rotivated weedy plots to try and get rid of the weeds, and that looks really great for the first week. You've got this lovely, nice, fresh, virgin soil, and then basically all you've done is cut your weeds into tiny little pieces and spread them out everywhere. So that actually can exacerbate the problem. So if you're digging and removing all of the parts, which can be quite laborious, then that's good. If not, it might be worth just trying to cut them back at the surface and see how you get on with that. And some of these things you can also mulch, so you can put them directly back onto your soil surface, the leaves of dandelions, for example, not the roots.
Thank you, Naomi. So we touched on challenges of growing in Scotland earlier, and we didn't say at the beginning, but one of the aims of GROW over as we develop the project fully is to enable growers to better respond to climate variability and climate change. And some of that comes with moving around Europe. And Peter has shared very different challenge that he's facing in France this June. They've had a very hot and dry June with water restrictions in force. Help.
Okay. I'm going to jump in on this one. Sorry, sorry, Blair. I'm kind of lazy and I never really water my allotment, and I'm not that great at weeding. So some of the weeds I leave, things like chickweed, which is one of the celarias, actually help keep water at the ground surface, so that's a kind of a living mulch. And similarly, you can add mulch. So even a little bit of organic material, or even rocks or stones, can help prevent evaporation from your soils and keep that in your soil surface. So evaporation happens on a gradient from wet to dry air. So obviously, when you've had a lot of dry air, that evaporation is higher. It pulls it through plants, and plants require more water. So reducing that evaporation potential from your soil surface by adding something, and that could be plastic, it could be cardboard, it could be organic matter, whatever suits you and the way you grow, that can really help. And it can be a kind of a living mulching, if you like, or a living manure. If something's lower than your crops and it's not really competing with them, it can help keep that humid environment around them. The other thing I've found is that if you continually water your plants, so I would witness lots of people on my allotment that would water every day, and what that does is that puts water into your soil surface and encourage root growth at the soil surface. So roots grow in response to the presence of water, and they'll grow in the direction side where they find water. So if you don't water them, obviously when they're little seedlings, you want to help them out, but beyond that, don't water them, and those plant roots will find their way down to deeper water, and they can be more healthy.
And I'll just pick up. Well, I'll just throw in another comment, because it also on mulching. So Eco Herentia, also on the webinar, asks, do you have any experience of living mulching while cropping? I mean, using some weeds like mulching.
Yeah, I think that relates to what I was just saying with both dandelions and things like chickweeds that are not dandelion leaves. You can just cut those and mulch them. You can also grow things specifically for a live mulch, and that means you've got plants growing either amongst your crops or adjacent to your crops that you're just going to cut and leave those leaves for it. I had a grapevine growing in my greenhouse, almost in Scotland, which was quite impressive. And it's just so prolific, produces so many leaves that I was cutting those and using them to mulch around my other plants as well. And that can really also help the previous problem that we're talking about in terms of retaining water in the soil surface and preventing that evaporation pool.
Okay, thank you. So we don't have much more time for questions. I've got one general one, and it's about, I'll maybe ask both of you to speak to, and it's around the insights that we can get from our contributions for science and for sort of wider environmental issues and concerns. As you know, with GROW, we're hoping to contribute various data that can really tackle some big challenges. One of those is soil moisture. Soil moisture is particularly important in many areas for drought, agriculture, etc. And we're working with scientists from European Space Agency and other places to validate the latest European Space Agency satellites. Just wanted to ask Blair and Naomi, where do you see some of the insights that can feed into science and the way we tackle environmental challenges?
So one of the things that we're hoping to do through the GROW Observatory is have perhaps thousands of people taking measurements of soil moisture, and that might be in a couple of different methods that we might use. By having this kind of real-time, on-the-ground monitoring of soil moisture, then that can help us form a broad scale. We can help hopefully observe patterns of changes across Europe. So if it's been a particularly dry spell, as our French participants are saying, then we might see a very dry soils appearing. But the important thing is how quickly that happens, and how long it takes to affect crops, and then also what kind of happens with extreme weather events. So if we've had a very long, prolonged period of dryness and soils become quite hard, then heavy rainfall events can actually cause other issues. So being able to use this data at a broad scale to understand what's happening across a range of soil types, and also potentially predict impacts onto crops and growers from current weather events or extreme weather events, whether that's flooding or drought, can be really useful.
If I could just pick up on a point there, Drew, I think one of the things for me that's quite exciting about this is the opportunity for communication between people. As I've said, I'm trying to grow some food in my own small way, and the opportunities to try different things and to learn about how best to do it, I think is one of the real fun things that can come out of GROW. To see what opportunities there are. Oh, I didn't think I could grow that. Maybe I could. Maybe somebody also in Northern Europe is doing something that's got an environment similar to Scotland, or maybe it's a crop that we haven't thought of. And then how can we learn about that and think about different varieties and different practices to diversify our local food supply.
So just thanking you both, and also thanking everyone who's contributed questions for us. There's some very familiar names in there. Many of you were on the MOOC and very active, and I look forward to our future events and hopefully meeting many of you face to face as well. We're now moving on to our final section, and this is to look at what's next for GROW, and hopefully for all of you as well. And so over to Pavlos.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Naomi and Blair, for sharing some great insights over the last hour or so. Speaking to our participants, I just want to say that it has been wonderful to see your interest on our online course and learn about your stories and practices. This is really encouraging as we are moving forward with some really exciting opportunities to engage, learn, and grow together. As a first step for the next period, we would like to invite you to engage and contribute to our online discussion around the topic, Your Soil, Your Data, for the month of July. You can do so by registering to our GROW forum at hub.growobservatory.org. This is a forum, it's all about bringing the community together to engage and exchange knowledge on soil and good growing practices through an open collaboration platform. Your contribution also gives us the opportunity to learn from you. We want to hear from you so we can design and deliver future themes. In fact, we were so inspired to see participants joining the online course from all corners of the world. For example, I was moved by a participant from the Azores, a tiny piece of land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It just shows that there is hope when people get a sense of how many we are, engage and participate even in the most unthinkable places. So this summer, we would like to give you the chance to further engage with the citizen science components introduced in the online course. We will help you observe several key soil properties, including soil moisture, soil stability, and biological activity levels to compare the effects of different management approaches. Composting and no-dig approaches were selected by you as priorities in our recent poll. So in the next months, you will be able to learn how to research and make sense of what happens in your own growing space and contribute to answering key wider questions on sustainable growing practices. We will give you full information on how to do this investigation, and we will be here to help you if you have any questions. And we want to help you in making observations in your own growing space and in using the results to understand if and how what you do makes a difference. Therefore, look out for our next series of soil experiments coming up in the next weeks and months. And don't forget to follow and share our tweets and Facebook posts, refer and tag GROW to your posts, especially when sharing your stories on your soil, your data on social media. Very importantly, keep in touch with what's going on. Subscribe to and share our newsletter and bring your local community into your journey with GROW. And remember that GROW is a citizens observatory that belongs to all of us, the citizens. The more we engage, the more value we create for the land, for science, and for our communities. So make GROW known to your local community, practitioners, local authorities, community gardeners, and whoever is interested in soil, food, and citizen science have a place for GROW. So here is once again some useful links for you to look out. This is the link to the GROW forum, which is hub.growobservatory.org, and of course our Twitter and Facebook accounts. So I'm hoping to see you online in the next months, exchanging data, exchanging knowledge, and passing back to Drew for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavlos. Well, that's it for us. GROW is a partnership of some community of growers, of scientists, some fantastic organizations from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization to IASA, University of Dundee, design and technology partners, through to Europe-wide growing associations, such as the Permaculture Association and Cultivate. We invite you, as Pavlos has just said, to join us on this journey, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event or activity. So thanks from all of us to you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.